a virtual conference on community leadership, and we just heard a presentation from George Longley on ancient Greek political theory. And now we're going to turn to our second presentation by Bárbara Alexandre Aniceto. And Bárbara has always been passionate about history and has a deep desire to understand women's roles throughout historical ages, and specifically in Greek antiquity. As a result of this passion, she has decided to work on research and teaching once she recognized the importance of both. She is looking forward to this presentation today and is going to enlighten us all on her paper entitled, "Did Greek Women Have a Leading Voice? A Gender Discussion on Female Roles in Classical Athens." And the floor is now yours, Bárbara.
Thank you so much, John, for the presentation. I'm really happy to be here. I'd like to thank all SASA members as well for this amazing opportunity. I'm really happy to be here, to be able to share my research whilst learning from all the amazing talks and roundtables that will be presented. Everybody's seeing my screen, I believe. So the presentation that I prepared today, one second, let me see if I'm seeing it properly. The presentation that I prepared, let me do it like this. Okay, now it's good. Whose title is, "Did Greek Women Have a Leading Voice? A Gender Discussion on Female Roles in Classical Athens," is a part of my doctorate research. I'm currently finishing my PhD. So what I'm about to share with you all is a partial result of my work, which I have been conducting for the past 3 years and a half at São Paulo State University, under the supervision of Professor Margarida Maria de Carvalho. Today, I chose to address the female roles in classical Athens with close attention to that of the Gine or Gamete, what we translate as the citizen's wife, as you can see from here. Let me see if I can share properly, one second. Yeah, no, let me do it like this. There we go. So here we have both terms, Gine or Gamete. I have been working on gender issues in the classical Athenian society since my master's, during which I examined Aristophanes' depiction of married women, married Greek women. Back then, I aimed to understand the political and social reasons that led the comic writer to depict in his plots women in such an active position. The explanation I came upon the most, held by the Greek historiography from the 19th century until the mid-20th, claimed that Aristophanes positioned powerful women in a leading role exclusively to cause laughter in the male audience. Not only do I differ from this perspective, but I also perceive a positive portrayal of legitimate wives in Aristophanic comedies. So by analyzing 3 of his plays from a gender angle, a gender perspective, and here we have the female plays written by Aristophanes, so Lysistrata, Thesmophoria Susai, and Assembly Women, I was able to comprehend the close connections among married women, the polis, and the Athenian democracy. In pursuance of expanding our frames of reference regarding the possibilities of women's leadership, and most precisely what this leadership could actually mean, especially towards their own bodies, in my PhD, I'm connecting Aristophanic textual evidence with the Hippocratic medical treatises. So here we can take a look at the female treatises, or as we call gynecological ones. Let me do it like this so you can see. Of the nearly 60 treatises which compose the so-called Corpus Hippocraticum, 10 focus on female issues, which means that a quarter, I want to call attention to that, a quarter of the collection involves women's affairs. The texts are, as you can see, on generation, on nature of the child, on diseases of women 1 and 2, on nature of women, on barrenness, on diseases of girls or on the virgins, on superfetation, on the 7-month infant, on the 8-month infant, and on excision of the fetus. These treatises offer us a detailed account of women's bodies, nature, and lives. Alongside medical theorizations and treatments, I identify through physicians' descriptions, as we shall see soon, social situations in which we find the presence of wives' sexual appetite during intercourse. So I named them. They are here, as we can see, the main points. And the wisdom they shared regarding the physiological processes experienced by their bodies. This is very interesting to see in our documental corpus, such as menstruation and the conception of children, and also the domain over certain gender expectations cast to their role as women, namely the will or not to become pregnant. Investigating both testimonies, my purpose is to set how the female body was physiologically and culturally conceived in Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, particularly in its relation to women's sexual experiences. Thus, I argue, married women could, in fact, have had a much more significant impact on society than we might have expected at first sight. They were capable of perceiving the intimate relation among their bodily wisdom, sexual reproduction, and their civic status as married women, and could have used this social combination to their advantage, along with the polists, by subverting the meaning of bearing a child. So, before diving into the textual evidence, I'm going to proceed with a brief background on Aristophanes and Hippocrates. Although my primary concern lies in Athens, it is important to remember, as we shall see here on the maps. So here in red, we have all the Greek colonies, and I'm calling attention to Kos and Kinidus. So it's important to remember, to bear in mind that ancient medicine did not start in Athens. Hippocrates was born on the ancient island of Kos, where medicine first came to be. Along with another Greek colony, Cnidus, or in ancient Greek, Kinidos, he and other physicians gave life to the movement of teaching and broadcasting medicine through other ancient Greek cities, such as Athens. As we can see on the maps, these cities were quite distant. So we can see them here, Kos, Kinidos, and Athens is here. They were quite distant, but Hippocratic physicians managed to spread medicine because a large part of them traveled through the Mediterranean. Born at the time of democratic consolidation as a political system in 450 BC, Aristophanes witnessed several historical shifts in the Athenian polis. In 443 BC, 7 years after the birth of the comic writer, Pericles became a strategos, a state leader. At the age of 19, the young poet witnessed the beginning of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, which would later form the backdrop to Lysistrata. A keen observer and a rather outspoken critic, Aristophanes documented the troubled political landscape that formed Athens during the classical age. By assembling philosophical, religious, legal, public, and private information close to Athenian political, social, and cultural life, I understand Aristophanic references as a comic and historical allegory of daily situations. The fictional circumstances displayed by Aristophanes in his female comedies are based on concrete exchanges of everyday life in the city. Exchanges carried out between Greek married women and their husbands. His female characters correspond to a greater or lesser extent, of course, to wives, slaves, concubines, prostitutes, mothers, and daughters. That is, to collectives that were part of the civic relations in Athens, as well as in other polis. Thus, when I consider the Aristophanic work as a part of my documental corpus, I conceive his theatrical propositions as historical testimony. I certainly do not consider his female plots as a faithful depiction of the social reality he was embedded in, but as a theatrical and critical view of the ongoing gender relations in which he was simultaneously a spectator himself and a central figure, both as an Athenian man and as a playwright. Moving on to the Hippocratic collection, I also find important to note, so here as we can see the cities together, Athens, Kos, and Cnidus, and here Kos and Cnidus. Actually, Cnidus or Cnidus is not an island, it is a peninsula, right? As we can see from here. So I find it important to note that Hippocratic collection represents the combined effort of many authors who dedicated themselves to registering and broadcasting their methodological, nosological, and pharmacological discoveries, as well as formulating and establishing what medicine was, especially from the point of view of an expanding medical community in the Greek cities of the 5th and 4th centuries BC. These Hippocratic discoveries were at the core of political, economical, and cultural changes the polis and colonies were facing, thus contributing to creating new perspectives on Hellenic culture. One example of these significant changes, which directly correlate with married women, is precisely the leading representation of them by Aristophanes and Hippocrates, as we shall see. Based on these considerations, I believe that one of the main crossroads between Aristophanic comedy and Hippocratic treatises lies in women's sexual behavior, specifically of married women, which were grounded in a specific bodily wisdom and desires that they share at different times. The physicians and the comic writer were able to capture and represent such behaviors. So, although I recognize the existence of a very well-established female pattern that pervaded women's social lives, what scholars call the good wife model, rooted in Simonides de Amorgo's iambic poetry from the 7th century BC, I also perceive how Aristophanes and the Hippocratic physicians show us women who were an exception to the rule. More importantly, not only could these women be an exception, but also there could have been actual gaps between this female pattern and daily activities concerning how wives conducted their personal yet communal affairs, as we can see from this slide. So there is a distance here which I want to grasp. In her well-known work, Women's Bodies in Classical Greek Science, Leslie Dean Jones states that the fulfillment of becoming a mother entirely shaped Greek women's experiences, since it was what society demanded from them. And again, although this statement is perfectly accurate, we, as women of nowadays and as scholars, must do the historical exercise of transporting ourselves to that age to grasp the importance of childbearing. Due to our social and political achievements in the past years, the idea of bearing a child and getting married as the highest accomplishment of our lives may seem reductionist or even oppressive. But we must note that being a mother in ancient Athens was not just about motherhood itself, nor was it about the private and intimate feeling of discovering a new self-identity. It was mainly about sustaining the community and the polis. I believe legitimate wives were fully aware of the public and political power they held, as we can verify from this Lysistrata passage. So for the sake of the time, I'm not going to read the whole passage, but I highlighted the main points here. The first comedy in ancient Greek theater to show a female lead character, Lysistrata addresses women's unhappiness with the continuity of the military conflict between Athens and Sparta with the Peloponnesian War, which, according to the wives in the play, stemmed from the city's mismanagement, from this male mismanagement, based on sexual renunciation and on taking off the Acropolis, where men kept the public treasury. They demanded an end to the Peloponnesian War. In this passage, she, like the whole group of women's chorus, turns their speech straight to all the Athenian citizens. So they say, cities of Athens. In ancient Greek, we have the expression pantes astoi. So we can see here, pantes astoi. And in doing so, the character is actually speaking to the male audience who were attending the Lenaea festival, who were at the theater. It is the poet himself who is addressing his public, and he consciously decided to speak his mind about the war theme through women, namely married women. Why did he do so? It seems to me that Aristophanes chose to enunciate women's positive and essential role in the city rather than corroborate their supposed inferiority. We visualize those women placing themselves as counselors because they say, let's see. We begin by offering the city valuable advice. When they state this, and so they place themselves as counselors, and we can also see that the legitimacy to make their statement lies chiefly on motherhood. After announcing she will advise both men and the polis, she concludes her thought, she, women's chorus, with the ultimate reasoning. I have a stake in our community. My contribution is man. In ancient Greek, we have the sentence, as we can see here, kai gar andras esphero, with the verb esphero in its active use, which indicates put forward for consideration. A political meaning underlies the verb, which correlates to Lysistrata's public display. She is responsible for bringing a new citizen into the world, equally important for advising men on crucial topics regarding polis maintenance. Pericles proposed the law of citizenship transmission, and 1 year later, this law was approved. As a consequence of the law, women became a critical element in the definition of citizenship alongside men. Applicable since the middle of the 5th century BC, the decree established that only those born to Athenian fathers and mothers would be considered citizens. Thus, the comic wives depicted by Aristophanes are those who, in everyday life, also held the responsibility for this proper reproduction, this political reproduction. Hence, although the primary motivation of the law was not to appraise women, I believe its application contributed over time to create a favorable view of women's participation in the citizenship granting process. When we consider the temporal distance between the decree and the Aristophanic plays, we can see in this hiatus the construction and consolidation of a political logic that started to include wives as a key element of a man's civic identity. The little boy who was just born would be an Athenian, would be considered an Athenian only if his mother was too. It is not far-fetched to assume that the law was conducive to, even if unintentionally, social importance to legitimate wives. In analyzing the comic heroism of all Aristophanes' plays, Cedric Whitman explains that the female characters' actions come from their feminine universe. I share the author's idea when he argues that the heroine tactically uses her feminine attributes and her social place to mobilize women and end the war, because this is what subverting motherhood means. They draw their leading voice from the social experience of maternity. When we turn to the Hippocratic evidence, the existence of a shared and safe space where women could build their bodily wisdom and use it when necessary becomes even clearer. So let me show you another passage. In the treatise on generation, the author is discussing the effects of pleasure on men and women's bodies. At one point, he describes how, in his medical perspective, conception physiologically works. Again, I'm not going to read everything, only the main points. The author says that the women, or the woman here, will become pregnant if this is what she intends. And the terminology here comes from the ancient Greek ethelo. Take a closer look, ethelo, which presents an idea of wanting, desiring, being willing to, consenting to. Thus, it points to the manifestation of women's desire, from which we can infer the presence or not of the female's will to conceive. This passage shows us the woman's intention to conceive a child at the moment of intercourse and leads us to understand that this decision depended on her will, if not exclusive, at least a little. Also, according to the medical explanation, the uterus would possess the ability to close itself after receiving the seeds of the man and the woman for the sake of conception, as we can see here. He states, for the uterus, on receiving the seed and closing, holds it inside itself, as its mouth contracts in response to the moisture. In my point of view, the belief in this uterine movement would be directly connected to the plausibility of women's choices regarding pregnancy. In addition, the passage also points out the women's wisdom concerning their own body and their explicit knowledge about the menstruation cycle once, as we can also see, and if the woman is experienced in giving birth and notices when the seed does not come out but remains inside her, she will know on which day she has conceived. It is important to mark that although the Hippocratic collection was written by men, and they often display their male perspectives on the female body, they were also based on female oral tradition. Both scholars, Aline Roussel and Anne Ellis Hansen, draw attention to the presence of what they call the experienced woman, as we have just seen in the gynecological texts, which we have just seen from one of the passages here. Both scholars suggest that this aspect, among many others, of course, may indicate medical deference towards women's authority on their bodies. Aristophanes and Hippocrates lived in the same historical period and on the same cultural grounds. I believe the playwright drew many of his comic propositions from actual married women's lives. And the same did the Hippocratics with regard to the knowledge they shared and taught throughout Greece. Alongside this, women could choose whether to have a child depending on their will, or when to have a child. Although the comic characters are not real, they were built from common women who were a fundamental part of the city. Ultimately, without legitimate wives, there would not be a polis, because they held the responsibility of bearing not only a male child, but a future citizen. On the other hand, this power could have led them to display a leading voice, perhaps politically, by speaking their minds regarding city's affairs among each other, perhaps with their husbands, and perhaps sexually. So, a leading voice towards sexuality by gaining experience from childbirth and by recognizing the power they had in their hands. That's it. Thank you so much for listening to me.
All right, a virtual round of applause for Barbara. Thank you so much. Feel free to pose any questions that you might have on your streaming location of choice. In the meantime, I'll ask a question to get us started. So Aristophanes' Lysistrata is one of my favorites, and it's just such a farce, the whole thing, right? Because of and especially with regard to the way that the men are portrayed, right? They are portrayed as like slaves to their desires, and they can't help but have these sexual urges and things like that. So, you know, arguably Aristophanes is making fun of men for that. On the flip side, women are seen as the kind of the leaders, and they've organized this sex strike against the men, and so in many ways their role in society can be seen as inverted, right? So the men are being inverted and the women are being inverted. So how much of do you think, in your scholarly opinion, how much do you think that Aristophanes is simply playing with the idea of inverting social roles and using that as a critique on the kind of leadership in the city and whatnot? I hope that makes sense.
It makes. Thank you so much for the question, John. So I believe he's definitely reinforcing the social boundaries. You know, he doesn't. It's not his intention to deeply question Athenian society regarding women. And that's precisely why he positioned women as childbearing, you know, like their main role is to bear a child, is to politically and publicly contribute with men. But I argue, and you mentioned something very important, he represents men as slaves to their own desire. And we know that, or at least as historians, we would expect that this would not happen because men would have relationships with their concubine or their or prostitutes. So the sexual strike, it's not about sexual relationships per se, you know, it's about what women represent. If they do not conceive, there will be not a polis, right? Especially because of Pericles' law. So I believe he's portraying women in a positive way, but not in such a positive way that could lead Athenian society or the Greeks to a revolution, for example, you know, something like this. But definitely calls attention to women's positive impact in my point of view. I don't know if I answered you properly.
No, you did wonderfully. Yeah, it makes me think of in Herodotus's histories, where Xerxes says that in response to Artemisia, that his women have become men and his men have become women, and it's just this, again, this inversion. But the inversion is not criticizing the female; it's criticizing the male. You know what I mean? So
exactly.
Mhm.
That's it. And he consciously chooses to do this with women. You know, this is very precious because as historians, I feel that we have been actually reinforcing Greek women's inferiority, you know, by saying, oh, women were inferior, they were considered inferior. So the only plausible motive for him to add leading women would be to make men laugh, you know, would be but actually he's criticizing the men. We have several passages in Lysistrata, Thesmophoros, Assembly Women, where the female characters explicitly say, if we ruled the city, things would be much better. You know, they say this.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. And I just want
Thank
to
you for
also
the question.
convey the thanks to our viewers who are saying thank you so much all over the chat. So thank you very much, Barbara. And next we will turn to our third and final presenter of this panel, Ronald Clark. Ron, feel free to join the screen here.
I'm here.
Okay. That's the wrong thing.
I'll need to share screen.
Yeah, Barbara, if you could stop sharing your screen.
Of course, just 1 second.